In the winter of 1913, a file arrived at the Vatican archives that would remain sealed for 100 years. The document was not long. It contained fewer than 60 pages. Yet the cover bore a warning written in red ink by a senior archivist of the Holy Office. The note read simply, "Do not reopen before the year 2013. Contents may disturb the faithful." For decades, the file sat untouched inside a locked drawer beneath the Apostolic Palace. Archivists catalogued it but were forbidden from reading it. Even senior clergy rarely spoke of it. The name on the file was short, Santoro, and beneath it, one line written in Latin, Ritual Noctis, the ritual of the night. According to the archive register, the case began far from Rome, in a quiet coastal town in southern Italy called San Lucido. At the time, San Lucido was a small fishing village pressed between the sea and steep hills of olive trees. Life moved slowly there. Families had known each other for generations, and the church bell divided the day into predictable hours. The parish priest was a man named Father Matteo Ricci. Parish records described him as patient, methodical, and deeply respected by the community. He had served the town for nearly 15 years without incident, until the Santoro family arrived. They moved into a stone house at the edge of the village in early autumn of 1912. The father, Alessandro Santoro, was a widower in his early 40s. With him came his only daughter, Lucia. Villagers remembered her immediately, not because she caused trouble, but because she barely spoke. Lucia Santoro was 16 years old when she first arrived in San Lucido. Witnesses later described her as pale, with dark hair that fell almost to her waist. She rarely looked directly at anyone when spoken to. At first, people assumed she was shy. Her mother had died the previous year in Naples, and the Santoros had relocated to escape painful memories. Grief, the villagers believed, explained the girl's silence. For several weeks, life continued normally. Alessandro Santoro worked repairing fishing nets and occasionally helped local fishermen repair small boats. Lucia stayed mostly inside their house overlooking the sea. But small details began to worry the neighbors. A woman named Maria Ventresca, who lived next door, would later give testimony recorded by the parish. She claimed that every night around midnight, she heard Lucia speaking through the open window of her room. The strange part was not the talking. It was the language. Maria insisted the voice was not Italian. At first she thought it might be Latin, something the girl had learned in church. But the tone was wrong. The words were sharp and uneven, spoken in a whisper that sometimes rose suddenly into a low growl. Several nights, Maria stepped outside to listen more closely. She expected to hear two voices, a conversation. Instead, there was only Lucia, speaking as if someone were answering her. Another neighbor reported seeing Lucia walking along the cliffs after midnight. She moved slowly, barefoot, her head tilted slightly downward. One fisherman named Paolo Romano described an encounter that unsettled him deeply. He was returning from the harbor before dawn when he saw Lucia standing near the edge of the cliff path. The sea was rough that night, waves striking the rocks below with a hollow roar. Paolo greeted her politely. "Signorina Santoro, you should not be out here alone." Lucia turned toward him. What he noticed first were her eyes. They were open, but they did not seem focused on him. They stared slightly past his shoulder, as if observing something standing behind him. Paolo later stated that the girl spoke a single sentence in a calm voice. But it was not directed at him. She said quietly, "He does not like the sea tonight." Paolo asked her who she meant. Lucia did not answer. She simply walked past him and disappeared down the narrow path toward her house. For several weeks, these small incidents continued. None of them seemed serious enough to alarm the village. Yet the story spread quietly among neighbors. Then something happened that forced Alessandro Santoro to seek help. On the night of November 2nd, just after midnight, Maria Ventresca heard a violent crash from the Santoro house next door. She rushed outside along with several others. Inside the house, furniture had been overturned. A wooden table had been pushed nearly across the room. Glass lay shattered across the floor. Alessandro Santoro was kneeling near the staircase, trembling. He told the neighbors that Lucia had suddenly collapsed in the kitchen. At first he thought she had fainted, but when he tried to lift her, she began to shake violently. Her body arched backward in a way he said no person should be able to bend. Then she began speaking. But the voice, Alessandro insisted, was not his daughter's. It was deeper and older. The words came quickly, in a language he did not understand. When Alessandro tried to hold her down, she struck him across the face with such force that he fell against the table. Lucia had never been strong. Yet that night she threw the heavy table aside as if it weighed nothing. The neighbors helped carry her upstairs. By then she had gone completely silent. Her eyes were open, but she did not blink. The village doctor was summoned early the next morning. Dr. Lorenzo Bianchi examined Lucia carefully. His notes were later copied into the Vatican file. He recorded that the girl appeared exhausted but physically healthy. Her pulse was steady, her temperature normal. When asked about the previous night, Lucia seemed confused. She remembered nothing. Over the following week, however, the episodes returned. Sometimes they happened in the afternoon. Sometimes late at night. Lucia would suddenly freeze, her body stiff, her breathing slow and controlled. Then she would begin speaking again, in the strange language. Witnesses described the sound as rhythmic and deliberate, almost ceremonial. Dr. Bianchi suspected a neurological condition, perhaps epilepsy or hysteria, which at the time was commonly diagnosed in young women. He prescribed rest and herbal sedatives. They had no effect. If anything, the disturbances grew worse. By mid-November, Alessandro Santoro was sleeping in a chair outside his daughter's bedroom door. He told neighbors that during the night, he often heard footsteps moving across the room. But when he opened the door, Lucia remained in bed. One evening, shortly before sunset, Father Matteo Ricci was called to the Santoro home. Alessandro was desperate. He explained everything he had witnessed. The voice, the sudden strength, the strange language that Lucia spoke without memory afterward. Father Matteo listened carefully. The priest did not immediately assume anything supernatural. In fact, his first reaction was caution. He asked to speak privately with Lucia. When he entered her bedroom, the girl was sitting near the window overlooking the sea. The room smelled faintly of salt air and candle wax. Lucia greeted him politely. She appeared calm, even gentle. Father Matteo asked her if she had been feeling unwell. She shook her head. He asked if she remembered speaking strange words during the night. Again, she said no. Finally, Father Matteo placed a small crucifix on the table between them. He did not say anything about it. He simply watched. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Lucia's eyes shifted downward toward the crucifix. Her breathing changed. Slowly, her lips began to move. At first the voice was quiet, almost too faint to hear. But the language was unmistakably the same one witnesses had described. Father Matteo recognized immediately that it was not Latin. And it was not any language he had studied during his years in the seminary. The voice grew stronger. Lucia's posture changed as she spoke. Her shoulders straightened. Her head tilted slightly to the side. Father Matteo would later write a single sentence about that moment in his report. The expression on the girl's face was not her own. He asked gently, "Lucia, can you hear me?" The voice stopped. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his. For a brief moment, they appeared completely clear. Then Lucia smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was calm, almost patient. And the voice that answered him was deeper than before. It said in perfect Italian, "She hears you, but she is not the one listening." Father Matteo did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the crucifix from the table and held it up. The reaction was immediate. Lucia's body jerked violently backward. Her chair fell to the floor as she collapsed against the wall. The voice that followed was no longer calm. It was furious. And it spoke again in the same unknown language, faster and louder than before. Father Matteo left the house that evening deeply unsettled. He did not tell Alessandro everything he had witnessed. But later that night, He opened a locked cabinet in the sacristy of the church. Inside was a book rarely used, the Roman Ritual, a manual containing the official prayers for exorcism authorized by the church. For 2 nights, Father Matteo studied the text carefully. He prayed for guidance, because the signs he had observed were troubling. The unnatural strength, the unknown language, the violent reaction to sacred objects. These were all mentioned in the church's records of possession cases. Yet Father Matteo had never performed an exorcism before, and the church required permission from higher authority before such a ritual could begin. So on the morning of November 14, 1912, Father Matteo wrote a detailed letter describing everything he had witnessed. The letter was addressed to the diocesan office in Naples. He sealed it with wax and sent it by courier. 3 days later, a reply arrived. It was brief. The bishop had reviewed Father Matteo's account carefully. His response contained only a few lines, but those lines would eventually become part of the sealed Vatican file. The bishop instructed Father Matteo not to attempt any exorcism. Instead, he was told to observe Lucia Santoro carefully and record every incident in detail, because the bishop had already forwarded the report to Rome. And, according to the reply, someone from the Vatican itself was preparing to travel to San Lucido. The letter ended with a warning. Do not confront the voice again until the appointed priest arrives. Father Matteo obeyed. But during the next 5 nights, the disturbances inside the Santoro house became far more violent. And on the 6th night, something happened that no one in the village could explain. Shortly after midnight, several neighbors were awakened by the sound of church bells ringing. Not the small bell used for early prayer. The large iron bell in the tower. It was swinging wildly. Yet when villagers rushed into the church, they found the building completely empty. No rope had been pulled. No one was inside the tower. But the bell continued to ring. Slow, heavy, and steady. At the same moment, less than half a kilometer away, Lucia Santoro was sitting upright in her bed, her eyes open, her voice whispering in the darkness. And for the first time since the strange language began, witnesses would later report that the words were finally understood. Because the voice had changed. It was no longer speaking in an unknown tongue. It was speaking in Latin. And what it said caused Alessandro Santoro to flee the room in terror. Alessandro Santoro would later say that he did not remember deciding to run. The moment the words left Lucia's mouth, his body simply reacted. He stepped backward into the hallway, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the oil lamp. The light flickered across the walls as he struggled to steady himself. Inside the bedroom, Lucia remained sitting upright in the darkness. Her voice continued. The Latin was slow and deliberate, spoken with a clarity that no 16-year-old girl from a fishing village should have possessed. Alessandro had only a basic education in the language. Like many Catholic men of his generation, he had heard Latin during Mass, but he did not fully understand it. Yet the phrase repeating from his daughter's mouth was unmistakable. Non est hic domus ius. This is not our house. Then another line followed. Said Mea. But mine. The voice repeated the sentence again. And again. Alessandro could not bring himself to step back into the room. Instead, he remained frozen in the hallway while the whisper continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. Lucia lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes. When Alessandro returned to the room, she appeared to be asleep. Her breathing was slow and calm. But something inside the house had changed. He felt it immediately. Later, when Father Matteo recorded Alessandro's testimony, the man struggled to explain the sensation. He said the air in the house felt heavier. Not warmer, not colder, just wrong, as if the silence itself was pressing against the walls. The next morning, Lucia woke as if nothing had happened. She greeted her father normally. She even helped prepare breakfast. When Alessandro cautiously asked if she had slept well, she nodded. I had a dream, she said quietly. What kind of dream? He asked. Lucia hesitated. Then she looked toward the window, overlooking the sea. There was someone standing outside, she said. Alessandro felt his stomach tighten. Outside the house? Lucia shook her head slowly.
No.
Outside the dream. She could not explain what she meant. Later that day, Father Matteo visited again. Alessandro told him everything that had happened the previous night, including the Latin phrases. The priest listened in silence. When Alessandro finished, Father Matteo wrote the words carefully into a small notebook he carried in his coat. Then he asked a question. Did the voice sound like your daughter? Alessandro answered immediately.
No.
Father Matteo nodded slowly. That evening, he made a decision. Even though the bishop had instructed him to wait for the priest arriving from Rome, Father Matteo felt it was necessary to observe Lucia again in person. He returned to the Santoro house shortly after sunset. Lucia greeted him politely, just as she had before. She appeared calm, perhaps even slightly embarrassed by the attention surrounding her. During dinner she spoke very little, but nothing about her behavior seemed unnatural. Yet Father Matteo noticed something troubling. Lucia did not once look at the crucifix hanging on the wall above the dining table. Her eyes moved around the room freely, but they never rose above a certain point, as if she were deliberately avoiding something. After the meal, Father Matteo asked if he could speak with her privately again. Lucia agreed. They went upstairs to her bedroom. The sea outside was unusually calm that night. The wind had died completely, leaving the air heavy and still. Father Matteo closed the door behind them. Then, he placed the same crucifix on the table beside the bed. Lucia sat down across from him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The priest studied her face carefully. Lucia, he said gently, do you remember our last conversation? She nodded. Yes, Father. Do you remember speaking differently? Lucia lowered her eyes. My father told me. And, what do you think about it? She hesitated again. Then she answered quietly. I think something is wrong with me. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Father Matteo felt a moment of doubt. Perhaps this truly was a medical condition the doctor had not yet understood. But then Lucia's gaze slowly drifted toward the crucifix on the table. Her expression changed. Not suddenly, but gradually. The softness in her face faded, replaced by something colder. Her breathing slowed. Father Matteo had seen this transition once before. He reached slowly into his coat and removed a small bottle of holy water. He did not move toward her yet. He simply held the bottle in his hand. Lucia, he said quietly, can you tell me what you are feeling right now? Her head tilted slightly to one side. The movement was unnatural, almost mechanical. Then she spoke. But the voice was no longer the voice of a frightened 16-year-old girl. It was deeper, calmer, and filled with a quiet hostility. You have returned sooner than expected. Father Matteo felt a chill move down his spine. The voice continued. He told you to wait. The priest did not answer immediately. Instead, he uncorked the bottle of holy water. The reaction was immediate. Lucia's hands gripped the edge of the chair. Her fingers tightened until her knuckles turned white. You should not do that, the voice said slowly. Father Matteo stood. He raised the crucifix in one hand and sprinkled a small amount of holy water toward her. Lucia screamed. The sound echoed violently against the walls of the small bedroom. Her body jerked backward as if struck by an invisible force. The chair tipped over. Lucia collapsed onto the floor, her back arching in a way that made Father Matteo step backward in shock. Her arms twisted at unnatural angles as the voice began shouting again in the same unknown language. The priest began reciting the opening prayer from the Roman ritual. His voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lucia's laughter cut through the prayer like a blade. It was not human laughter. It sounded dry, ancient. You are not authorized, the voice said clearly. The word stopped Father Matteo mid-sentence. Lucia slowly turned her head toward him from the floor. Her eyes looked darker now, the pupils wide and unmoving. You do not have permission, the voice continued. Father Matteo stared at her. How would you know that? He asked. The smile that spread across Lucia's face was thin and knowing. Because the one who is coming does. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. Then Lucia's body suddenly relaxed. Her muscles loosened, as if a switch had been turned off. She collapsed onto her side, breathing heavily. When she looked up again, her eyes were clear. Confused. "Father," she whispered. She had no memory of what had just happened. Father Matteo helped her back into the bed. But he did not sleep that night. Instead, he returned to the church and waited. 3 days later, the priest from Rome finally arrived. His name was Father Antonio Valenti. Unlike Father Matteo, he had performed exorcisms before. But even before meeting Lucia Santoro, Father Valenti seemed unusually cautious. The documents later added to the Vatican file described him as a man in his early 50s with a calm but severe demeanor. He carried with him a leather case containing ritual texts, blessed oils, and several sealed envelopes bearing the seal of the Vatican. When Father Matteo finished explaining everything that had happened so far, Father Valenti remained silent for a long time. Then he asked a single question. "Has the voice revealed its name?" Father Matteo shook his head.
No.
Father Valenti nodded slowly. "That may be intentional." He then asked to see Lucia immediately. They arrived at the Santoro house just before sunset. Lucia was sitting near the window again when they entered the room. The moment her eyes fell on Father Valenti, something changed. Her posture stiffened. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Father Valenti stepped forward calmly. He placed a small wooden crucifix on the table. "Lucia Santoro," he said in a steady voice. The girl looked directly at him. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then her lips slowly parted. And the voice answered him. Not in Italian, not in Latin, but in a language neither priest had ever heard before. Father Valenti listened carefully. His expression darkened. When the voice finished speaking, the priest turned slowly toward Father Matteo. And for the first time since arriving in San Lucido, he appeared deeply disturbed, because he understood what the voice had said. And the meaning was something he had only encountered once before in his entire life. Father Valenti closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke very quietly. "We will not perform a standard exorcism." Father Matteo stared at him in confusion. "Why?" Father Valenti looked back toward Lucia. Or rather, toward the presence, now speaking through her. Then he answered. "Because this is not a possession that began in this house." He paused. "And if the words I just heard are true, it did not begin in this century."